So let me formally welcome you all to this forum. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. And I want to begin with prayer, and I've asked Rex to lead us in prayer today.
Merciful and gracious Heavenly Father, we do bless you and thank you for this opportunity to meet together, even though we're not physically present, that we can have this time of discussion. We do pray that you would guide our thoughts and our actions, cause us to glorify you in all things. May your Spirit help us to understand how to properly apply your word to the church in the present situation. We pray these things in Christ's precious name. Amen.
Amen. Before I dive into the questions, I want to make several comments about the questions surrounding the COVID crisis that you've submitted. And the first thing I want to say is the questions are difficult, at least in many cases, not easy to answer. And at least from my theological foundation, they're difficult to impossible in some cases to answer specifically. I do feel like I am that fool which rushes in where angels fear to tread, except that Rex said I should. And so I can blame him. At the same time, I've been thinking about questions like this for a long time. May interest you to know that 30 plus years ago, I completed my THM studies with a thesis in social ethics, actually. And that thesis was entitled Political Revolution in the Reformed Tradition. Just to give you a teaser about that thesis, I'm with John Calvin, not with John Knox. Anyway, much of what I will say today is informed by theological work done in connection with those studies. The second thing is I want to say the questions are important. At the same time that they are difficult in some cases, the questions are pressing, relevant, and important. And thus I feel an obligation to attempt some response to them. In some cases, I'll focus more on the principles on the basis of which the question should be answered than the answers to the question. In fact, the very first question we'll go to is going to be one that gets us into some of those principles. And then the questions, of course, are many. What was our final sign up for this forum?
62.
62. So there were like 62 questions to choose from, and many fine and interesting questions were submitted. I've chosen the following to have read. They are the ones I think will help us get into the major issues. I apologize if your question was not chosen, but we have attempted to choose representative questions from the different categories. I put together a folder with many helpful resources in it, and I'll be talking to Rex as to how to share that folder with you. I've got I don't know, some 20 plus resources in that folder, a lot of which I'll be mentioning while I answer questions, and we'll find a way to share that folder of different files on this subject with you all. My hope is that it will provide further help when our time runs out today. Of course, I'm happy to answer questions that are emailed to me. So that's the introduction that I wanted to give you about this. The first question we're going to go to is from Nick DiBenedetto.
Nick, you want to read your question?
Yeah. Dr. Waldron, what do you see as the overriding biblical principles in determining whether to gather as a church on the Lord's Day in light of the pandemic?
Yeah. Thank you, Nick, for that question. And it represents a number of other important questions. And I believe that first and most basic to answering questions like that is a clear understanding of the principles and applications of the biblical doctrine of human authority. I've summarized those principles in a lot of places. I'm going to, in the folder you'll receive, they're on in a folder entitled Acts number 30. It's my 30th sermon on the book of Acts, of course, based on one of the important passages in Acts about how we ought to obey God rather than man, and so forth. So I want to give you 5 observations just real briefly here about the biblical doctrine of human authority. And I think this kind of summarizes the biblical perspective and gives us the foundation upon which we have to build a response to the COVID-19 crisis. First, human authority is divine in its origin. Human authority is divine in its origin. It's not like the Bible would look at this as in every respect, God versus government, because government is divine in its authority. They are ministers of God, to allude to Romans 13. And really, no one has stated this more eloquently than Calvin when he said, and this is 2835 of the Institutes, "For to those to whom he gives any preeminence, he communicates his own authority as far as is necessary for the preservation of that preeminence. The titles of Father, God, and Lord are so eminently applicable to him that whenever we hear either of them mentioned, our minds cannot but be strongly affected with a sense of his majesty. Those, therefore, on whom he bestows these titles, he illuminates with a ray of divine splendor to render them all honorable in their respective stations." And so then he goes on to talk about fathers, princes. Our prince or our Lord, he says, enjoys an honor somewhat similar to that which is given to God. Now, this general principle is affirmed in Romans 13:1, where we see that every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. And so what's the practical implication of that? Well, because human authority is divine in its origin, it must be respected and submitted to, and I want to add then generally obeyed. Peter's assertion of the right to disobey human authority for good cause must not be made an excuse to ignore or defy legitimate human authorities which God has placed over us. And that can be illustrated many places in Scripture. Time does not permit. You can see those places. I mentioned them in a couple of the documents that you're going to be getting. Second, human authority is dignified in its character. All human authority is divine. As Calvin says, such human authorities are illumined by a ray of divine splendor. Probably no passage brings that out more clearly than Romans 13:7, which I think is directed against the Jewish revolutionary movement of the first century and speaks of the sinfulness of all revolt or armed violence against human authority. So what does this rule teach us? Well, the right to disobey may not be made the pretext for violent revolt. Disobedience is one thing. Violent revolt is something completely else in the Scripture, and according to Calvin as well. Third principle, human authority is derived in its nature. It is authority derived from God, and to be used for God as authority derived from God, it cannot therefore oblige us to sin against the law of God. And therefore, the rule regarding conscientious disobedience, which this truth teaches us, is obvious. When human authority requires the violation of God's law, then it must be disobeyed. Of course, this is the manifest meaning of what Peter says in Acts 4:19 and 20 and Acts 5:29. But that is not the only possible occasion when we can choose to disobey human authority. A lot of people say, well, we can only disobey when human authority tells us to sin. But there is another occasion which is at least distinct enough that I think we have to think about it. That brings me to the fourth thing we have to say about human authority. Human authority is diverse in its kind. No human authority is totalitarian. God has divided human authority since the fall of the theocratic state Church of Israel into several different categories and several different human authorities, and primarily three: the family, the state, and the church. And each of these three human authorities has a defined and limited sphere of jurisdiction. And so, for instance, in Ephesians 6:4, the scriptures address fathers and assume that it is fathers, not pastors or civil powers, that bring up their children in the Lord, and so forth. Now, the fourth rule then about conscientious disobedience that this brings to our attention is that when human authority exceeds the limits of its jurisdiction, it may be disobeyed. Not only when it tells us outright to sin against God, but when it's clear that it exceeds the limits of its jurisdiction, it may be disobeyed. Human authority has certain jurisdiction. Within that jurisdiction, it does have the right to make rules and laws. But this is what is implied in Luke 20:25, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. Well, lots more could be said about that, but let me come to the fifth principle. It is distinguishing in its bestowal. Human authority is distinguishing in its bestowal. Here I'm simply stating, or maybe restating the obvious. God does not give the same authority to everyone. God has not given civil, fatherly, husbandly, pastoral authority to everyone indiscriminately. He has not made everyone fathers, pastors, parents, or civil powers. And the rule that comes out of that is this: the conscientious disobedience, the duty to obey God rather than men, must never be made the pretext for usurping the vocation, privileges, and functions of an authority God has not given us. We cannot assume authority that God has not given us. That is presumptuous, and it's a sin against God. Well, those are the five principles that I think ought to inform our thinking on this subject. And maybe, Rex, before we open it up for any discussion, we should come to the next question.
Yeah, I think we should have Andrew Heath, a very related question. Would you read your question for us before we open up for discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. Should churches temporarily suspend services because of COVID-19?
And so this is a question that has to be answered, I believe, in light of the principles I've just laid out, and perhaps other principles as well, but certainly the ones I've just laid out for you are the major ones. And I really I very strongly relate to the difficulty of this, because this is one of the most difficult decisions we had to make as an eldership in this whole thing. So I have great sympathy for others who are also faced with this difficult decision. And in fact, we actually did not make it as an eldership until the Saturday morning before we canceled. And we only made it after our governor in Kentucky issued an executive order in which he directed churches not to meet. Now, I'll talk further about some of the principles which led us to this decision. Well, actually, I should say I have talked about some of those principles, but let me briefly explain how we applied those principles here. And in the folder I've prepared for this forum, I've given you the three letters with their dates, which shows kind of our evolving response to this whole situation, until the final letter in which we actually took the step to cancel services. Of course, there may be a fourth letter in which we decide to open them up again. But so let me say the following things very briefly, bullet point like. First, we had already decided previously to allow and even discourage our at-risk members not to come before we made the final decision, because we were convinced that while the COVID-19 might not pose an equal hazard to young people or children, it did pose a very real hazard to the number of people we have in our church that are at risk. One of those people, in fact, was my wife. She's a fairly severe asthmatic ever since we moved to Kentucky a number of years ago, on breathing treatments twice a day to keep her functioning. And I had made the decision that she was going to stop coming to church even before we canceled services in general. We were troubled also, but at the same time, I want to say we were really troubled by the lack of specificity in the governor's orders. It seemed very general, and we were troubled by that. I would have liked a lot more specificity in terms of our response. We were also troubled by the cavalier way, and in which religious services were categorized as not essential. That ground our socks. Nevertheless, I was of the conviction, after thinking about it, and I had pretty deep struggles of conscience for a day or two while I was reaching this point. I was of the conviction that quarantining on an emergency basis was within the government's jurisdiction. In other words, I believe that it is the duty of civil authority, as given from God, its primary duty to protect human life. And I believe included in that would be in emergency situations of war or plague to institute quarantining orders. And we'll come to maybe a question about some of the biblical data on that as well. Even if I disagreed with the judgment of our governor, and I very well may have, I also, after thinking about it, realized it was not my prerogative to make the judgment as to whether such quarantining was necessary. It was not my judgment, but the judgment of the civil authority that was pivotal here. It was the governor's prerogative because of the office God given him. For these reasons, we decided to submit to the governor's decree with the qualification clearly stated in our letter to the church at this time. What's the next question?
This would probably be a good time to open up a little bit.
Yeah.
Next one is Regis Kramer. How do the churches throughout history deal with?
Yeah. So we can have a couple of minutes of discussion here.
All right, let's open this up for a little bit of discussion. Like I said, if you click on raise your hand, I'll call on you and you can. Anyone? Yes, Darren Gilchrist.
So you mentioned about when human authority exceeds its jurisdiction, it may be disobeyed.
Mm-hmm.
If human authority exceeds its jurisdiction, are there times that it's okay to obey?
Yes, there are. The way I would put it, Darren, is that when human authority calls on us to sin, we must disobey. But when human authority exceeds its jurisdiction, I think the way to put it is we may disobey. I don't know how that strikes you, but the fact of the matter is that there may be situations where we say clearly to ourselves, the government has exceeded its jurisdiction here, but if we meet as a church, they're going to come at gunpoint and take us all away, or issue $500 tickets like they attempted to do in Louisville. So even if we thought to ourselves, that's exceeding the jurisdiction, it might be wise in those kind of situations, unless we thought they were outright telling us to sin, to comply rather than hazard the consequences. I'm trying to think of a good illustration of this. Pastors can exceed their authority. I once pastored two people that were told to marry each other by the leaders of their somewhat extreme charismatic community. They didn't have to obey that, but I guess I couldn't argue that they had to disobey it either, especially if they wanted to get married to each other. So I think the right way to put it is we must disobey if we're called on to sin. We may disobey if after our studying the matter carefully, the government or some other human authority has exceeded its jurisdiction. Parents may do this, pastors may do this, and the state may do this. And we need to ask serious questions about what their spheres of jurisdiction are.
All right, Addie.
Sorry, can you? Now, my question is, for example, in the United Kingdom, churches and all other religious services has been cancelled. Now, my question is, will it be appropriate, say, for some of the churches to meet together, consider some of these issues that have been raised, and develop a process in which those issues can be mitigated and then presented to the government with the hope of getting the government to rethink their position on this?
Addie, absolutely. There's nothing barring, and nothing I've said should be taken as barring or dismissing the possibility of pursuing legal means to take these things to the lawful authorities of the land and seek to get unreasonable laws overturned or orders overturned. I think that's perfectly legitimate, and I think it's completely within not only the right but even the duty of the church on some occasions, and this could be one of them, for instance, to litigate something like that. Litigation is a lawful means of resistance and a lawful means of disobedience, if I can put it that way, and completely consistent with submission to the civil authorities.
All right, Matt Jensen.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier that you kind of have a pin in whether or not you're going to meet later on. You kind of left that up in the air. So as an elder of our church, we're thinking along the exact same lines and wondering at what point we're trying to protect bodies at the expense of souls, and how long we should go before we start considering whether we should disobey.
Yeah. Well, I think the questions like that, and there were a number of them that were submitted to us, are some of the most difficult questions to answer. And partly because every situation may be a little different, and but I certainly do think that orders like we have here in Kentucky right now, if continued too long or applied too severely, would permit us and even mandate us to begin to defy them. I guess my counsel would be to be as patient and long-suffering to our government as possible. I think there's a principle in Titus 3 that would suggest that. Let me read it to you right here. Remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good deed, to malign no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing every consideration for all men. So I think we have to be patient and considerate, but at some point we do have to consider that these regulations may become excessively severe or excessively prolonged. And then I think, maybe litigation would be one option, but maybe disobedience and meeting anyway would be another option. But I certainly can't answer the question, when would that be? And I know we would be very slow to take that step, but that is something that we would take. Just as in our initial letters to our church, we told our church that the time might come when we would feel it legitimate to cancel services because the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So we said in our last letter to them that that we were canceling services, but not permanently and only at this time.
Okay. So you're not thinking along those lines right now. That's not really a discussion yet.
No, but it could become such a discussion.
Okay.
In our case here in Kentucky, I guess I would begin, and this is only reflecting our own situation here. I would begin to get really uncomfortable if things continue to go as they are, and we're not able to meet for services, say, by the 1st of June. I would begin to wonder what our obligation might be. But that's what it would mean here for me, at least personally, where I sit today.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, one more question before we move on. Joe Harper, or not a question, comment. Go ahead, Joe.
My question was essentially identical to the last one of Dr. Waldron, of just how we determine patiently when authority transitions from being, because you said it's legitimate, which I think is valid, which is true, but how do you determine when it goes from being legitimate to excessive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not an easy question, Joe. I think there have been more egregious illustrations of the misuse of authority by state governors than we have had here in Kentucky, although I'm no fan of our governor. But I think, for instance, there have been egregious and inappropriate, at least severe and inconsistent uses of the governor's authority, say in the state of Michigan.
Mm.
That's why you had 4 county sheriffs saying that they're not going to abide by her order, and that they're because they think she exceeded her authority, and all sorts of other things going on there. So yeah, and I just think that in those kind of situations, the eldership of a given church, given and their given civil situation, are going to have to spend a great deal of time on their faces before God and in the scriptures. But I do think it's possible they're going to reach the conclusion that this is excessive and that the church ought to begin to meet.
Thank you. That answers my question.
All right, let's move on to Regis Kramer. You want to read your question, Regis?
Yes, Dr. Waldron, how did churches throughout history deal with diseases and having to stop meeting together for a period of time? And has an event like this one ever happened in the way it's affecting the gathering of the saints?
Well, yeah, it certainly has happened in a number of different cases. I'm trying to get down to your question and my thoughts about it. And just let me give me. Yeah, in the folder I'm going to give you, and many of you may have seen this, but I think this is representative of good Puritan ethical thought on the subject. And so, and it's Richard Baxter's comments on this issue. First saw it because one of my fellow elders sent it to us. He'd found it someplace online or someplace else. Yeah, but if some of you haven't seen it, let me just. This is from the Practical Works of the Reverend Richard Baxter, Volume 5, 465, in the 1830 edition. The question is, may we omit church assemblies on the Lord's Day if the magistrate forbid them? Wow, there's pretty direct application of that to us. Answer, it is one thing to forbid them for a time upon some special cause, as infection by pestilence, fire, war, etc., and other to forbid them statedly or profanely. 2, it's one thing to omit them for a time and another to do it ordinarily. 3, it's one thing to omit them in formal obedience to the law and another thing to omit them in prudence or for necessity because we cannot keep them. 4, the assembly and the circumstances of the assembly must be distinguished. And he talks about a number of things there. So Baxter obviously knew of situations where this had happened, notwithstanding Baxter's fairly major problems in some other areas of his theology. I think this probably represents a standard Puritan thought on the matter. So yeah, so it has happened, and the response of Puritan ethical thought, as it's represented by Baxter at least, is yes, we may omit church assemblies on some occasions. One of the interesting legal discussions I read was back and forth on was in North Carolina, where some were asking, does the government have a right to do this? And some people were saying no, but other legal opinion was, as long as churches weren't singled out, and it was the general decree that that was not singling out churches, there was nothing problematic theologically in it. I think that's at least in general true. But if churches started to be singled out, that would be a completely different story. But if it's all gatherings of whatever kind, then that is a situation where I don't think that's persecution necessarily, and I think we ought to submit ourselves to the civil government, at least till such time as it becomes something else.
All right. Any comments on that before we move on to the next question? Which will be Kel.
Dr. Waldron, my question, which biblical truths do you find most appropriate to share with the Lord's people during this pandemic?
Thank you, Akil. Now, I thought it would be, I think God has given us some wisdom in terms of what we've preached on in, what happened here? Just a second. In the last several weeks since we have canceled services, and I thought it might be interesting to you to know what they are. I've actually included each of these sermons and a few others in a folder. And so I'm going to go down the line and list some of these. On the first day of our canceled services, March 22, I preached on what the Lamb is doing on the throne from Revelation 6. We've also posted Rex's sermon on Revelation 5 and 6, which I think makes some similar points in it. So that one, I guess, I was trying to emphasize, look, the Lamb is in control of this, and that means whatever's happening is accomplishing the redemptive purposes of God. And then on March 29, I preached a sermon on how to glorify God during COVID-19. And I had 3 points: by being strong in faith from Romans 4:19 to 21, the example of Abraham; by considering your ways, Psalm 119:59. What does this new situation reveal about ways in which you should think about repenting and turning back to God in your life? And then the last one was by prizing your privileges. And I talked about prizing the privileges you no longer have because of what's going on, and prizing the privileges that you continue to have. And generally, my emphasis was on developing more thankfulness, even as a stated part of our prayer life. Then on April 5, Pastor Ben Carlson preached in our morning service an excellent message on loving the brethren in the present distress. He preached that from Hebrews 13:1, let brotherly love continue. And I thought he made some excellent practical suggestions. And then on what for most people is called Easter Sunday, April 12th, I did preach a message. I don't feel obligated to follow the religious calendar, but I did preach a message that Lord's Day on what you should think of the resurrection of Christ. So I preached a resurrection sermon on that subject. That you should, and I said you should think that it's foundational, believable, and federal. And if you want to know what I meant by any of those things, you can look it up on Sermon Audio. So that's, I think God has helped us so far in setting before our people the right kind of things. So the first three sermons did have particularly to do with the COVID-19 distress. But then, I don't think that every sermon has to be that. And I think a reminder of the importance of the resurrection when a time of year when everybody's thinking about it was a good thing as well.
All right, let's move on to the next questions closely related. Eduardo Flores Rivera.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Waldron, my question is how to approach the pastoral work in a pandemic regarding visitations, counseling, administration of the ordinances, etc.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know that I'm going to say anything that some of you haven't already thought of, but I'll give you some things that I've done and that we've done. But I also have to acknowledge before I answer this question that everyone's situation may be a little different depending on government guidelines in your particular situation. But everyone can make use of their phones to check in with the needy among the flock. That's one of the first decisions we made. We had 4 people that we knew were widows in the more explicit sense, and we used to contact older. We made a decision that one of the pastors would call all 4 of those older at-risk saints to see how they're doing. I've also used the phone to contact those who have lost jobs or had to go on unemployment. My wife and I, we could go visit with members who are at a greater distance. They actually live up in Indiana across the river. We visited one family and talked with them at a correct social distance in the driveway of their home. We also used a convenient parking lot overlooking the Ohio River in Newburgh, Indiana, to talk with some other members of our church and just to catch up with them. And so that was another thing that we did. I've taken the occasion, sometimes I walk with people in our church, and I've taken the occasion to walk with members of our church more frequently. Of course, we try to walk at a correct social distance, of course. I've been doing that anyway, but I've tried to do it more frequently. As I will say later, I think it's proper, because your question included this, I think it's proper to defer the celebration of the ordinances and especially the Lord's Supper until the restrictions against assembling are lifted by the government. But we'll come back to that issue of the Lord's Supper in another question.
Yep. All right. Well, any comments, discussion on that before we move on to Scott Wakefield's next question? All right. Go ahead, Scott. Read your question.
Yeah, thanks. What ecclesiological truths was the typical evangelical church in America missing before that COVID-19 has made clearer?
That's a great question, and my answer is certainly going to be partial and probably miss some things that it shouldn't miss. But I hope that the COVID-19 distress has made clear the distinctive and sacred character of the church's formal assemblies for public worship. I think one of the major problems with evangelicalism today is that they've lost, there's been a loss generally of a sense of the sacred. So, every day is the same, no distinction of days. All of life is worship, and other such, Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship, all of this kind of nonsense, which at best is half-truth, I think is related to a lack of respect and understanding of the importance of the church and its formal assemblies for public worship. Now, unlike some, I believe in using the internet to hold virtual worship services during COVID-19. I do not, however, believe those services are an adequate substitute or are equivalent to the formal assemblies of the church. My hope is that people will feel and sense the spiritual truth. Of course, I also fear that some will think Zoom and Facebook Live will make such meetings of the church even less of a priority for them. But I do believe, and I've said so in a number of things I've written, Regular Principle of the Church published by Chapel Library, and in my stuff on the Regular Principle and more than the 5 points, I believe there's a distinctive presence of God promised to the gathered church in Matthew 18, 1 Corinthians 5, 1 Timothy 3, and other passages. And I hope that the absence of such assemblies will make the heart grow fonder, as the old saying goes, and not the opposite. I'm certainly hopeful that that will be the case. Excuse me a second. I hope, and Brian Borgman talks about that whole thing in the blog that I've included in the folder and that I shared in several places. I hope Christian people miss grievously and then attend more faithfully, therefore, the public worship of their church hereafter. So that's the one thing that I want to emphasize with regard to this.
Next question is closely related. James Williams, you want to read your question?
Yeah. Some churches have held weekly services through some form of internet medium during the shelter-in-place order. Others have chosen to encourage family worship with an expectation of reunion with the local body. Are there obvious dangers to either that we should be aware of? If so, what are some examples?
Yeah, I think there are dangers, not dangers such as to disqualify one of the alternatives or the other, but I think there are dangers in both directions. The danger in having internet services is giving the impression that they're a replacement for the gathered assembly when they are absolutely not. The great danger of not having them is that you're denying the public ministry of the word to the church when there are ways in which such ministry might be enjoyed. And I also think that the use of internet services is an assistance, and this is an application for principle I hold anyway, that the public worship of the church is an assistance to the individual Christian in sanctifying the Sabbath. So those are the dangers on the one side or the other. I'm sure that one could lay a lot more out in a lot more detail. On the one hand, making people think that they're a replacement for the gathered assembly, they're not. On the other hand, not providing whatever ministry the church can by using those internet means.
Any discussion before we move on to the next question? Again, press that raise your hand button if you want to say something. All right, we'll move on to Michael Lee's question.
Yes, Dr. Waldron, our church's live stream does not facilitate fellowship. We use YouTube. Are there particular technological avenues that you recommend for fellowship before and after services or throughout the week? Mm-hmm. And along the same lines, what are ways that we can be doing good works during a time of social distancing?
Yeah. Well, Our thinking about this has been developing, and our technology has been developing too. And what we finally come to is that we're broadcasting our morning service through Sermon Audio Live. That's the right terminology, right?
I believe so.
Yeah. And we try to do our normal order of service. We tried to use Zoom for that, but we're trying to at least give people someone leading and singing and the piano so they can sing at home. And Zoom was not working very well for that. So that's why we moved to Sermon Audio Live. But we did, after talking with some other pastors, I realized that Zoom could be useful for us to renew again. After the third week, I think, or fourth week, we decided to have our evening service in a cut down kind of way. So in our evening service is where we have our corporate prayer meeting. And so our evening service now is just a time of preaching, and then we go to a time of corporate prayer. And Zoom does work well for that, and so that facilitates fellowship. We were talking with Dr. Tom Hicks on the phone the other day, and he said that they were doing something similar and just leaving Zoom on for another 20 minutes. So if people wanted to talk to each other, they could do so. We hold on Wednesday evenings once a month three small groups in our church, and I used Zoom for small group last Wednesday, and we had I think a really significant and good time of fellowship, sharing prayer requests and bringing each other up to date on what's going on in our families. And that was really good, and Zoom was useful for that. So Zoom is not so helpful for anything that involves music, we've discovered, but it is helpful to facilitating the kind of fellowship, at least at some level, that you're interested in. We've had some people really creatively in our church do a couple of things that were consistent with the social distancing orders that are in place. One of them was that maybe you've come across people having car parades and things like that. I don't know if you have, but I've seen it on Facebook. And we have one of our pastors has a beloved daughter. She's played the happy birthday to her and tossed our cards out onto the lawn for her. And she was so excited, thrilled, and happy about that. And that was a wonderful exhibition of Christian love to Deborah, whom everybody loves. Then we had a visit a couple of Sundays ago by several families in our church, and they brought a guitar and they sang hymns and gospel choruses to my aged father and my wife and I on our front lawn, and I thought it was a good testimony to all of our neighbors and who were very interested in what was going on up on the hill on our front lawn. So those are some illustrations and ideas that have happened that I'm thankful for, those illustrations of Christian love that have been, people have done creatively, and I hope and think consistently with the orders that are in place.
Yeah, I'd just add that, you can use Zoom. The free account will allow you to have 40-minute meetings. So you don't even have to, if you want to use Zoom for church fellowship, it doesn't have to cost you anything. And it's considering the situation, I think it's a good tool.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's move on to TJ Hoosier's got a question that probably, I think the biggest group of questions we had were regarding this issue. We've already alluded to it a little bit, but TJ, you want to read your question?
Certainly. Like you touched on earlier, Dr. Waldron, how do we handle the ordinances, baptism, and particularly the Lord's Supper under this circumstance? Does a husband have the authority in his sphere to administer the Lord's Supper under the direction of his elders, or should one abstain from that?
Well, on the one hand, this was an easier question for me to answer because it involves some straightforward applications of things I already believed and held firmly. On the other hand, I do think that we need to allow a certain measure of charity. We must have a certain measure of charity to people who may differ from us. But several things are clear. First of all, the Lord's Supper is a sacrament of the local church. I've always believed that the Lord's Supper should only be celebrated in the formal gathered assembly of the church. Even down to questions like, do we take the Lord's Supper with a group of people to a member who is shut in? I've never felt that that was a good idea, because it seems to me that an essential part of the celebration of the Lord's Supper is that it is a sharing in a supper by the church. So that being the case, online communion and other such things is, in my view, a violation of the scriptures. And I think we should defer celebration of the ordinances until they can be celebrated again in the gathered assembly. And it also seems to me that if you, while I do have charity for people that might have slightly different views than myself on that issue, it does seem to me that there is very clearly here a slippery slope where the sacred character of the Lord's Supper could be gradually diminished and then finally demolished, and in a way that is in no wise good for the status of the Lord's Supper or for the church. Jeff Johnson's article that was published on the Founders Ministries site is in the folder, and you can find other online discussions of this. I don't recommend the United Methodist discussions of it, but I think there are some other good articles. There's a pro and con thing in Gospel Coalition, I believe, that you could read. And I look for a pretty good article that Anthea Mathenia put me in contact with by a British man, but I could not find it yesterday when I was looking for it. But I think you'll find some good online discussions of this, but that's my position with regard to the Lord's Supper. In my view, baptism is a more individual ordinance, and as long as it's administered by a lawful representative of the local church, a stated representative of the local church, I think that the baptism can be, and obviously the scripture has illustrations of it being celebrated more privately. So I think it's more of an individual ordinance than a corporate ordinance. And so I think it's more possible to think of a situation where it might be administered during the present distress than it is for the Lord's table.
Thank you, sir.
Darren?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think maybe Anthony was referring to Gary Williams.
Can you?
Yeah, so it's the John Owen, he's the director of the John Owen Center. He was responding actually to a Welsh pastor, if this is the one he was referring to, who sort of lined up on the side of it's okay to do it in exceptional circumstances. I personally wasn't convinced by Stephen Clark's position. I would be more in line with Jeff Johnson, but it does give you a helpful sort of, to be honest, a little bit of it seemed almost Gnostic, to be fair, from the Welsh guy side of it. Yeah. But it was an attempt to take that position. So I think it's Gary Williams, John Owen Center, and Stephen Clark, and I think they posted it on the Evangelical Movement of Wales website, but I can find those links if you want them.
Yeah, I'd appreciate if you'd send them to me. That is what I was referring to and thinking of, but I couldn't bring back some of those details. If you'd send them to me, I'll get them into the folder and we'll make them available to you.
Okay, will do.
All right, Scott Wakefield.
Yeah, a quick question asking about a little more specificity about when you cross over into gathered assembly that warrants celebration of the Lord's Supper. Obviously, that would constitute pastoral presence, elders, more people outside of just a family. But we're going to be making some decisions about these things in the coming weeks, assuming a slower phased in gathering process. I think regardless of what we think we're going to be doing, that's probably what's going to functionally happen. So what percentage of the gathered body has to be there, and who has to be there in order for that to be something that is a warranted practice? 50%?
That's a great question, and it's an important question. And it really comes down to this, and it's important in other regards too. As I've argued in my treatment of the regulative principle, I believe that it's the regulative principle of the church, and that its major application to worship is to the worship of the church, and not private family worship, any of those kind of things. I think that's what that the regulative principle is for, and it's an application of the worship of the church. And there are key passages that I think are talking about that issue: Matthew 18:15-20, 1 Corinthians 5:1-13. I think both those passages are talking about meetings of the church, and those meetings of the church as having a distinctive and sacred presence of Christ in them. So my answer to the question, given what I understand from those passages about the scripture, would be that it has to be a formally called meeting of the church called by the elders of the church, and I would not make the exact percentage of the church that could be there a fundamental issue of whether there's a church or not. Of course, I think the elders should be wise to call meetings of the church only when the mass of the church can be there. But in the language of Matthew 18:20, if 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst. I take that to be a reference to the smallest conceivable local church. So if the elders of the church called a meeting of the church, and with the most wisdom that they could muster, given the situation that's going on, I would regard even a very small meeting as a legitimate meeting of the church, and in that meeting, I would feel at liberty to celebrate the Lord's Supper. In contrast to this, take small groups, for instance. I think the small groups have utility. I don't think they're exactly appointed precisely by in the Bible, although I think they fulfill some biblical functions. But I don't think anybody should get to the position where they think the small groups could exercise church discipline, which is what Matthew 18 and 1 Corinthians 5 are talking about. And in the same way, I don't think small groups should take the liberty to celebrate the Lord's table. I think it has to be a meeting of the whole church, but the exact percentage of the church that actually shows up is not the major issue in my view. I hope I made that clear.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Next question is by Gardner Fish.
Yes, Dr. Waldron, how do we plan to effectively encourage our sheep to return to the corporate gatherings once the government lifts the social distancing guidelines? and especially among members who remain afraid of the virus?
Oh. Well, first of all, I think a lot of this comes back to the way we've instructed our people. I mean, for a lot of very specific reasons, we have attempted to teach our people about the unique presence of God promised to the formal assemblies of his people, and therefore why those assemblies are regulated, especially by God. And so I really do hope that teaching and that emphasis on the importance of the public assembly will bear fruit. Now, I certainly would counsel a great deal of patience, especially if churches somehow decide to start services while in, let's just say, situations that seem iffy to some people. I wanted to, before we cancel services, I wanted to make clear to our at-risk members that they ought to feel no obligation to come. In fact, we got to the point of discouraging or counseling, not discouraging, counseling them not to come. We wouldn't have said they were in sin to come at that point. But I do think that we ought to be very patient with people like that. Because, and especially with at-risk people that might be afraid of it, and be tender and long-suffering. I guess that's what I would counsel. Obviously, at some point, I've been meditating a sermon in which I talk about the biblical doctrine of physical contact with people, including references to public assembly and the holy kiss and the Lord's Supper, all of which require some measure of physical contact with other believers. And at some point there's an end, but I would counsel a great deal of patience and long suffering right now.
Okay. Any discussion before we move on to Josue's question? Yes, Akel.
I just wanted to add that sometimes I think with these situations, it's very helpful to keep the shepherd-sheep illustration in mind. So as Dr. Waldron was saying, Dr. Waldron, you have sheep who may be wounded as a result of this mentally, emotionally, and you're not going to hit them over their heads with the staff and say, get to church, but you really have to tenderly treat with them accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Good point. All right, let's move on to Josue Colon's question.
Hey, Dr. Waldron. So my question is, how do we best utilize the Lord's Day since we are not able to meet as a congregation to worship the Lord?
Okay, this is one of those, questions I feel permitted to say, here is what we have done. I'm sure if there were time that some of you could add to what I'm about to say. First of all, we have continued right from the beginning some schedule of public ministry. As I said already, March 22, we conducted a worship service in the morning using our normal order of service broadcasted through Zoom. March 29, we did the same thing. After that, we figured out we couldn't use Zoom for what we wanted to do in the morning. So April 5, we switched to Sermon Audio Live and did the same thing. April 12, we've been happy with what's been happening there. And then in April 12, we decided to add to the morning worship service that we broadcasted over Sermon Audio and evening worship using Zoom. The evening service consisted of preaching and corporate prayer. To facilitate prayer, we had two seasons, corporate and then personal. Corporate concerns and personal concerns is what I mean. Before the service, I chose 3 men to pray during each season. Before we started an evening service, during the COVID-19, we've always had an evening service. I used the late afternoons myself, if the weather was nice, to go on a long prayer walk in a local park. We also found interesting and edifying documentaries or things to listen to on interesting what you can find on Netflix or Prime Video. We listened to the life of John Knox, and we found some other interesting things on there that were profitable to do on a Lord's Day. In general, the disruption has made a little more time simply to get more physical rest on the Lord's Day as well. So I've been thankful for that as well. And that's certainly a proper use of the Lord's Day, although I don't think it's the primary way in which we're supposed to rest. We're supposed to rest to the Lord, but I think physical rest is a part of
it. Chris.
Yeah, you mentioned John Knox, and sorry, I guess I should have put this comment forth when you talked about John Knox earlier. But with regards to, I think it was revolt, a political revolt, you said you sided with Calvin over Knox. Is it okay if I ask you to explain that a little bit? Since you just mentioned Knox in your comment here.
Sure. Like I said, I wrote my THM thesis on political revolution in the Reformed tradition and historical and biblical critique. And basically what I attempted to show in that thesis, among other things, was that Calvin was an anti-revolutionary. He did not permit, I showed it from his institutes, from his commentaries, and from his letters, that Calvin was opposed to anything like violent revolution on the part of Christians. Actually, the Presbyterian tradition, Samuel Rutherford, John Knox, began to develop in a direction that ultimately became quite opposed to Calvin's teaching, and advocated violent revolution in Scotland, among other places, by John Knox. I was pleasantly surprised that the Netflix documentary they watched actually got it right. They said very explicitly that John Knox and Calvin disagreed with each other on that issue, and I think that's the correct understanding, in fact. So yeah, I'm an anti-revolutionary like Calvin. And I don't believe the Bible permits Christians to engage in violent revolution. Obviously, that's a long discussion, but if you would like to see my thesis on it, I'll send it to your brother. Just write me.
All right, thank you. I plan to.
Let me, well, before we started having evening services, my family always likes to make use of sermon audio for times like that. And our go-tos are Jim Savascio, one of our board members in Louisville, Kentucky, Joel Beakey, who no one is surprised to hear me suggest, and Sam Renahan is especially during this time, has been, he's got some very comforting and encouraging messages on sermon audio that are worth checking out as well. All right, the next question is Jordan Gerard's. I'm going to go ahead and ask your question, Jordan.
Yeah, do global pandemics have any eschatological significance, or are they merely one of the results of the fall?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. It was similar to a couple of other questions, and but I like your question. Yeah, and my response is yes. Yes, I think they are. They do have eschatological significance, and they're not just a result of the fall. And I think you'll see that if you see my own message on Revelation 6, and also Rex's on Revelation 5 and 6, we'll argue from an amillennial perspective that they're evidence of the Lamb's reign over the interadventual period, the time between his first and second advents. They are predicted. They are the predicted characteristics of this age as the Lamb breaks the seals. One of those seals is the gray horse, I think probably better, the sickly green horse. And so, which involves pestilence and plague and mass death. And so I do think that global pandemics are an evidence of the Lamb's breaking the seals on the book of God's redemptive purpose. Now, having said that, of course, they are not proof that Jesus is about to come back. If I hear one more time, oh, there was war, there's pandemic, there's plague, Jesus is about to come back, I think, I'll have to write 25,000 blogs on that or something. I don't know how people can say stuff like that with a passage like Matthew 24, 6-8 in front of them in the Bible, which I think does teach that this age will be characterized, this present interadventual period will be characterized by such things, but at the same time explicitly says that these events are not signs of Jesus' near return. Let me just read you the passage. You'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. Oh, but all the prophetic teachers say it is the end, but it's not the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. And we could easily add from the other accounts and parallel passages, pestilences and plagues. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. They're not the sign that birth is imminent. They're the beginning of birth pangs. And so I just want to say that yes, there's signs that Jesus is reigning. There's signs of the fact that the last age of this age has come upon the world, but they're not proof that he is about to return in the way that that's usually said. Yes, they do mean that the last days are upon us, but the last days began with Jesus' resurrection. And just do a word study of that in the New Testament, and you'll quickly come across a lot of evidence that'll prove that to you. So the end is not yet. The interadventual period is, the Lamb is reigning, but the end is not yet.
All right, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask Chris Bell to ask the last question.
I'm honored. The last question. Wow. Okay. What can we, well, I should probably pull up the email. What can we learn and apply from the quarantine laws of Leviticus 13 and 14?
Okay, I'm looking for your question here on my list. Just a second. What was that under? I'll get there. Just give me a second. Here it is. Okay. I do think there's things to be learned from these laws. And the reason I think that is because I believe the assertion of chapter 19, paragraph 4 of the confession is biblical and scriptural, and in fact, finely so. To them also he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired with the state of that people. He means the nation of Israel. Not obliging any now by virtue of that institution, their general equity only being of moral use. By the way, the original reading apparently of the confession is not modern use, but moral use. I know there's some discussion of that, but I checked the 1677 facsimile version I have this morning, and it is moral use. So in my view, and I hadn't thought about this actually, but I was on a call with Scott Brown, Anthony Mathenia, and Jeff Pollard talking about this on a podcast. And Scott pointed out that there were quarantine laws in the Old Testament. And I thought, oh yeah, that's interesting. And it didn't change my view, but it did confirm me in my view. So in my view, the quarantine laws of the Old Testament suggest that it's within the jurisdiction of civil authority to restrict men and women from general social interaction. And if you read Leviticus 13 and 14, that had to have included public worship, if they carry a deadly infectious disease, or even if they're suspected of carrying it, I think. So in that case, it was leprosy. So yeah, I do think there are things to learn and apply, and I think it is an illustration of the legitimate interest and jurisdiction of civil government to impose quarantine if there is significant danger to the public health. Obviously, that raises a lot more questions, but in general, I think that's true.
My fellow administrator would like to ask one final question before we.
Which administrator is this?
Bryce.
Okay.
Go
If
ahead,
it's
Bryce.
Blake, I might not let him do it, but if Bryce, I'll let him do it.
Dr. Waldron, this has kind of raised the question along the way here. You know, it struck me talking to people, Christians and non-Christians, people just at the store about what's going on. It struck me more than usual the different points of view that are had toward the situation related to what news people are ingesting. So I'm wondering if you could give us some guidelines as far as, with so much information coming out every day, different perspectives, then there's the official perspective. What are some guidelines or some counsel related to how we process the news and counsel our churches to do that?
Well, I do think we should be informed. And of course, in our day and age, when everything is so heavily politicized, it's difficult to know who to trust about what. I've tried to find some websites that I think at least attempt to be even-handed in their approach to this, or just give, facts. I'm on something called, I check it in the morning to see how things are going. United States Corona virus thing. Worldometer, it's called, info coronavirus. So I try to check that to see for myself what the facts are and what seems significant to me. I do think that it's easy, and I find this in my own spirit. I really, I think that in my own spirit I could be, and I express it to my wife and my dad occasionally. Quite concerned about the totalitarian instincts of some of our leaders, and I don't like that at all, and I want to resist that. At the same time, I as a pastor try to stay away from, as much as I can as a pastor, being too politically vocal, except if I'm dealing with straightforwardly moral issues. And I will preach on those kind of moral issues that involve politics, but I do think that I try to maintain a pretty clear distinction between my private views of certain things and what I would like to be publicly promulgating on the internet. So we have, I think we have quite different views of this in our own church, and that's fine as long as people are tolerant of each other and are wise in how they do these things. I don't mind having different views of what should have been done or should be done on this issue. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Bryce. I just think we should be very careful, especially as pastors, of how strongly we express ourselves with regard to points of view that are mainly political and not mainly moral and scriptural.
And Chris had his hand raised. Did you have something else to say, Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify why I had asked my prior question. Dang it, now I can't remember what my comments were. Oh yeah, something that's just been going on in the chat here has been some discussion about quarantining healthy people, and that's what's been going on, is that the governments have been asking everybody to stay inside on the presupposition that, well, you could be a secret carrier or you could have the disease and not know about it, and the argument about symptomatic versus asymptomatic, and that's why I asked the question. Also, I did take the symbolics class, just finished the final exam last week.
Good for you.
So it got 97%. So I'm working on the paper right now. So I am very familiar with that discussion going on about general equity and everything else that was discussed in the lectures and the textbook. So just wanted to encourage you about that.
Thank you, brother.
We won't tell anyone you're a socialist, Dr. Waldron.
I'm a what?
Socialist.
Wow, that's the first time I've ever been called that. I will say that sometimes I worry that there's a pretty broad streak of libertarianism. Since you're going to call me a socialist, I'll have to say there's a pretty broad streak of libertarianism in a lot of Christians, which I wonder if it does full justice to the legitimate place of civil government, human life. Anyway, now I've made half of you mad, and I'm sorry.
I think functionally we're all socialists now.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's true, isn't it?
At least we're all suffering the consequences. Okay, well, that's it for the forum. Like I said, everybody stay on, and I will take roll. And